Hi, good morning, everybody. My name is Sonia Romero. I am the Human Resources Generalist at AIG Bermuda, and I will be your moderator for today's session on the authority gap. On behalf of AIG Bermuda, our partners Chubb and AXA XL, we'd like to welcome close to 800 virtual audience members and close to 100 in-person audience members. As a reminder, today's session is meant to be interactive, so at the end of today's session, we will have an opportunity for both our in-person and our virtual audience members to ask questions of our panelists. Joining us today, Ms. Cathy Duffy, leader of AIG Bermuda. She is also a prominence in Bermuda's international insurance business or industry. She's an author and a diversity, equity, and inclusion champion. Also with us today, Mary Ann Sieghart. She's a London-based journalist, broadcaster, author, or what you may call a portfolio woman, because you do many things. You are a director of the Guardian newspaper, and you also create radio programs for the BBC. But for the purpose of today's session, you are the author of the highly acclaimed book, The Authority Gap, which looks at why women are still not taken as seriously in the workplace. And we have a visual here, the studies that we have been conducting. So we're gonna, the book takes a closer look at why women aren't taken as seriously as men in the workplace, but most importantly, what we can do about it. So you've done a lot of research and you have a lot of great ideas on how organizations can tackle the gender bias and help women reach the top. So let's dive in. Just to set the tone and a little context, what exactly is the authority gap?
Well, thanks very much, Sonia. The authority gap is a measure of how much more seriously we take men than women, of how we're still more reluctant to accord authority to women than to men. So women are twice as likely as men to say that they have to provide evidence of their competence, and much more likely than men to say that people are often surprised at their ability. And when I was asked to give a lecture on this topic at Oxford University, I thought, well, I better define my terms. So I literally just Googled authority definition. The very first result that came up on my search was from the Oxford Online Dictionary. And guess what? Every single sentence that they used as an illustration of a different use of the word authority began with the same pronoun. I think you can guess which it was. Mm-hmm. So there was, he had the natural authority of one who is used to being obeyed. He hit the ball with authority. He was an authority on the stock market. I wasn't even looking for this, I was just looking for a definition. But sometimes your subject just sort of comes and smacks you in the face, And I thought, well, hang on a minute, didn't Margaret Thatcher have the natural authority of one who was used to being obeyed? And doesn't Serena Williams hit the ball with authority? But this is just an illustration of how much more we associate male with authority than female.
Wow. And how have you seen the authority gap manifest itself?
Well, classic examples of it are that women are much more likely to be underestimated, more likely to be patronized, more likely to be interrupted or talked over, more likely to have their views ignored when they make a point at a meeting, more likely to have their expertise challenged, and more likely to have their authority resisted. In terms of authority, I mean in terms of leadership or power. And there is lots of evidence of this, but I think we'll come on to that.
Yes, that was actually leading into my next question. What evidence do you have that to show that the authority gap still exists?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of men will say, oh, come on, this is just old hat. Your thesis is out of date. Surely women are doing really well these days. There is a lot of evidence to prove that the authority gap still exists. So I'm going to start by talking about something that sounds a bit anecdotal, but you'll see why it's scientific when I get there. So suppose you're a woman who's up against a man for a promotion or for a new job, and he gets it and you don't. You may suspect that bias was at play, but it's incredibly hard to prove because he may genuinely be better than you. He may be more deserving of that job or promotion than you are. So what I decided was that it would be really interesting to look into the experience of trans people, because they're exactly the same person with the same ability and intelligence and personality and experience and body of work. And if they find that people's reaction to them changes dramatically after they transition to the opposite sex, then that to me is slam dunk proof of the existence of the authority gap. Because what you've done is you've controlled for all the other variables and you've isolated the only one that matters, which is gender. Sure enough, this is exactly what happens. So I tell the story in the book of two Stanford science professors who happened to transition at exactly the same time, by coincidence, in opposite directions. And they used to meet up and compare notes. Now, Ben Barres, who is a neuroscience professor, transitioned from female to male. And afterwards he said, I've had the thought 1,000,000 times, I'm just taken more seriously now. My work is taken more seriously. The same damned work, as he put it, is taken more seriously now that people see me as a man. And someone was overheard at the back of one of his seminars who didn't know his history, saying, oh, Ben Barres gave a great seminar today, but his work's so much better than his sister's. Meanwhile, Joan Roughgarden, who is an evolutionary biologist, transitioned in the opposite direction. And she said, when I was living as a man, I just felt like I was on this conveyor belt to success. And I kept getting promoted and my pay kept rising and I was asked to sit on the university Senate committee. I mean, it was just all so easy for him as she was then. And she said, once I started living as a woman, all that changed. She lost her seat on the university Senate committee, her pay stopped rising. But most of all, she came up against all these instances of authority gap behavior that I write about in the book. So she said I couldn't finish a sentence without being interrupted by a man. If I made a point at a meeting, no one took any notice until a man repeated it, all this sort of thing. And she said, well, to start with, I thought, if I'm going to live as a woman, I'm darn well going to be discriminated against like a woman. And then she said, well, the thrill of that is worn off, I can tell you. And her conclusion, very similar to mine, was that a man is assumed to be competent until proven otherwise, and a woman is assumed to be incompetent until she proves otherwise. So this is actually, it sounds very anecdotal, that's just two people, but it's borne out by much bigger studies by sociologists of the experiences of trans men and women. And trans men in particular say they just feel so much more respected once they start living as a man. And sociologists have also shown that their pay rises faster. And trans women say the opposite, and often say, I had no idea of how much sexism still existed until I started living as a woman, because when they were living as a man, they just didn't see it. But there's also quite a lot of academic research to support the behavior that I've talked about, the existence of it. So, for instance, interruption, which I think is one of the most annoying things as a woman, because first of all, it implies that the man, because it's usually the man who does the interrupting, what the man has to say is more interesting and more important than what you're saying, which is humiliating. And secondly, it is literally silencing you. It's shutting you down. Men do it to women much more than women do, and they do it to women more than they do it to men. And the sort of interrupting they do, on the whole, evidence shows, is more of a negative interruption, i.e. shutting you up. Women also interrupt, but they tend to do it in a more positive way, affirming what the other person is saying. You know, they'll say, oh yes, I agree, or yes, that's a good point, allowing the person to carry on and bigging them up. With men, it tends to be more negative. And however senior you are not immune from it. So there was one fascinating study done of US Supreme Court proceedings. And you don't get much more authoritative than being a US Supreme Court justice, right? And women, when this study was done, made up 1/3 of all justices, but they had to suffer 2/3 of all interruptions. In other words, they were 4 times more likely to be interrupted than their male counterparts, 96% of the time by men. And another study, which I think is very interesting, is of this phenomenon that I've mentioned already about you make a point at a meeting, no one takes a blind bit of notice, a man makes exactly the same point 10 minutes later, and it's treated like the second coming, right? And when this happens, we tend to beat ourselves up and we think, oh no, you know, perhaps I wasn't confident enough or I wasn't articulate enough. No, you were just too female. And so there was a fascinating study. They put a mixed gender group of people together, because this is not just a male thing, and I make the point all the way through the book, women are also biased too against other women. a mixed gender group of people to discuss a child custody case. And they deliberately chose this subject because it's actually quite female stereotyped, and you'd expect women to be good at it. And they gave the group all sorts of information about the family concerned. But they gave a couple of individuals a piece of information that the rest of the group didn't have. And when that piece of information was introduced by a man, it was 6 times more likely to be used by the group in their deliberations than when it was introduced by a woman.
Wow.
That's how much harder it is for a woman to influence a group.
Wow. So do you find that it's mainly men that demonstrate this authority gap behavior, or are women also demonstrating this behavior against each other?
It is a bit of both. It is more often men, but women are not immune from it. So I think women are also more likely to expect a man to be more expert than a woman. They're less likely to interrupt, but I think they are more likely to associate male with authority than female with authority. And it's not really surprising because we've all grown up in the same world, right? You know, we've probably grown up in families in which our father earned more than our mother, almost certainly worked more than our mother, possibly had more authority at home than our mother. We've all grown up in a society in which men are still basically in charge. I mean, in the UK, I think there are currently 6 female CEOs in the FTSE 100, so 94 men for 6 women. In our parliament, there are still twice as many men as women in a supposedly representative democracy. And in our cabinet, there are 3 times as many men as women. And so, you know, that is bound to create this unconscious bias in our heads that men are more authoritative than women. We see it when we watch movies. Men have, you know, much more speaking time than women. You're still much more likely to have a man in a position of agency, you know, doing stuff, with the women as a sort of sex object or the helpmeet. And so this message is being sort of thrown at us every day.
Yes. And so why would you say it is in the man's best interest to try and narrow this authority gap?
Well, this was the most encouraging thing I discovered from my research, because I had expected I was going to write this book and I was going to say to men, guys, please, I need to appeal to your altruism, to your sense of fair play, to your sense of justice, you know, please back us up. But it's not really in your interest. But this isn't the case. So you would think it was a zero-sum game, right? That gender equality would be like a seesaw, and as women rise, men fall, and frankly, you can't blame them for wanting to stop it. But actually, no, it turns out to be a positive-sum game, that actually men gain from more gender equality as well as women. And you think, how can that be? Well, so many studies have been done that show that both in more gender equal relationships, that is straight relationships, in which the man and the woman share the chores pretty equally, share the childcare pretty equally, and in more gender equal countries and societies, not only are the women happier and healthier, which you would expect, and the children are happier and healthier, and they do better at school, and they have fewer behavioral difficulties, and the girls are more ambitious, and the boys are less likely to be violent and to get into trouble, and they get on better with their dads. But the men themselves are also happier and healthier. And so they are twice as likely to say they're satisfied with their lives, half as likely to be depressed, much less likely to get divorced. They tend to drink less, smoke less, take fewer drugs, get more sleep at night, and here is the absolute clincher, they get more frequent and better sex. I nearly thought I'd put that on my cover, actually, to try and say men to read the book. So guys, it's really in your interest. And also just both in personal terms, at home, at work. I mean, frankly, we can tell within 2 minutes of meeting a guy whether they're the good guys who are listening to us just as attentively as they would to men, who are taking us seriously, or whether they're the bad guys who are frankly looking over our shoulders, glazing over, sizing up our tits, you know. Yeah. I mean, we can tell really quickly. And frankly, we're not interested in the latter group. We don't want to date them, we don't want to be friends with them, we don't want to be colleagues with them, ideally. So being sexist is just not a good look for a man.
Wow. Excellent. So at this time, I'll hand it over to Cathy for a deeper dive into the topic of the authority gap.
Oh my goodness, so much. You know, The one thing about diversity, when we actually dive into it, which is why we use that word, is that there's nothing really new that we're learning. It just reinforces some of the behaviors that we experience, and also allows us to know that we're not alone in these feelings. But, you know, Mary Ann, you touched on so much in that conversation with Sonia. Thank you, Sonia, for the questions. And I just wanted to have a conversation with you about some of the experiences that still happen for women, particularly the higher you go up, the more you see some of the backlash. And that was something you talked about in the book with Julia Gillard, and how she wished that she would have spoken up earlier about the sexism that she experienced. Because if you wait until later, people dismiss it. Can you talk a little bit more about that? Because that's quite interesting. As women rise up, the more you get pushback.
Yes, it's interesting, isn't it? Because you would think that the more senior you are, the harder it is for people to question your credentials. But actually, for men in particular, there is a lot of backlash, because the more senior you are, the more threatening you are to them, and particularly if you're in a position of authority over them.
Yes.
Now, that is the instinctive reaction of a lot of men, not all men, of course, but a lot of men. But actually what the objective evidence shows is that women actually make better bosses than men, and that their employees rate them more highly than men. So there was a meta-study of 99 research studies which showed that women are rated more highly than men as leaders, but male leaders rate themselves more highly than female leaders, which I thought was interesting. But yes, it is. I think a lot of people want more senior women to fail, and quite often they will, if a woman gets to a very senior position, people will say, oh, well, she's just a diversity hire. And of course, much more so if they're a woman of colour as well. So I'm sure we'll come on to this.
Yes.
Or the authority gap is much wider for women of colour than it is for white women.
Yes.
But even for white women, you know, there is a sense of, oh, she didn't get there on her merits. She got there because they needed to fill a quota. And so again, you've got to prove yourself so much more.
Yes. And actually that is a very interesting segue into women of color, and how women of color, particularly black women, are expected to be more assertive and all of those things. So people expect that more than they do for white women. But that also comes back as a negative, because then women of color, particularly black women, are labeled as angry, aggressive, when all we're trying to do is stand our ground. How do we deal with that? And what, in your research, you basically proved that that is true.
Yeah.
Yes.
So in general, women are twice as likely as men to say they have to provide evidence of their competence, as I said earlier, and are much more likely to say people are surprised at their abilities. Women of colour are twice as likely as white women to say these things. So basically, the further you are from the white male middle class default, the wider is the authority gap.
Yeah.
And of course, you then get racial stereotypes overlaid on gender stereotypes. And so, as you were saying, yeah, very acutely there, that if black women are assertive, maybe you get interrupted at a meeting and you stand up for yourself, suddenly you're the angry black woman. On the other hand, there is also research showing that black women have slightly more license to be confident and assertive, and people feel less uncomfortable about it because they're expected to be, because of this stereotype. So part of the problem with the authority gap comes down to confidence, okay? So boys are socialized to be more confident than girls. All the way through childhood, you see that boys are called on much more in class than girls are. Girls are rewarded for being quiet and well-behaved. Boys are rewarded for speaking out and being confident. When you look at the peer pressure, the way boys bond tends to be through a sort of boastful competitiveness. You know, my dad's got a better car than yours. I've scored more goals this season than you have. For girls, it's exactly the opposite. If a girl behaved like that, she would be completely ostracized by her peers. And indeed, her parents would say to her, nobody likes a boastful girl. My parents said that to me.
Yes.
And so girls bond by doing exactly the opposite, by being modest, self-deprecating, by saying, oh, I'm useless at maths, or I hate my hair, or my bum's too big, you know, and it's by admitting vulnerability to each other that they bond. And that carries through into adulthood as well. That's how you make friends with another woman, isn't it? By admitting your failings.
Yes.
Men hate doing that to each other because vulnerability is a weakness. And so when it comes to being as confident or as assertive as men, A, we haven't been trained for it. We've been trained to do the opposite. B, because we come up against all these instances of authority gap behavior, all of these things dent our confidence.
Yes.
Every time you get talked over, ignored, patronized, challenged, underestimated, that's going to dent your confidence, right? Men don't come across this behavior nearly as much unless they have a very bullying boss. But thirdly, even if we do act as confidently and as assertively as a man, people don't like it. It makes them feel really uncomfortable. And they start using adjectives about us such as abrasive, strident, aggressive, bossy, overbearing, scary, cold, stern. You know, you've heard all these. Even bitchy, ball-breaking, ambitious. I'm sure we'll come to ambition. Pushy.
Yes.
And for displaying exactly the same characteristics that our male colleagues display. Why is that? Because we still have these incredibly old-fashioned and anachronistic stereotypes sort of buried in the deeper recesses of our brains that tell us that women ought to be acting in what social psychologists call a communal way. So we are supposed to be warm and nurturing and kind and collaborative and unthreatening and unself-promoting and unassertive. Whereas men are supposed to act in what's called an agentic way. That means being confident and assertive and showing leadership. The trouble is, if we act in a communal way, no one's going to take us seriously at all, are they?
That's true.
And so there's this double bind. Either we're not confident enough and we're disrespected, or we are confident enough and we're disliked.
Yes.
And you may say, well, we should just grow a thicker skin, and if only... we just shouldn't care about whether people like us or not. But the trouble is that the research shows that when it comes to likability, it's a much more important factor for women for promotion and hiring decisions than it is for men. And so we have to be liked and respected, which is very hard.
It's a thin line.
It's a thin line.
Yes.
And what both research shows, and also I did a lot of interviews for this book with very, very successful authoritative women, you know, former, you mentioned Julia Gillard, you know, former prime ministers, presidents, Supreme Court justices, that sort of thing. And what they said almost to a woman is that they had to overlay a lot of warmth onto their authority in order for it to be accepted by people. And this is what the research shows too. Warm authority is the only way to navigate this very fine path between being disrespected and being disliked. And it's exhausting.
Yes.
And it's a burden that men just don't have to bear.
Yep. But at the same time, I agree with you, it is exhausting. Like, you have to get up every day and sort of say, okay, I'm going to face the world today and I have to get myself ready for it, right? With the fact that we have that warmness and communal sense about us and vulnerability, we become really great transformational leaders.
Absolutely. So transformational leadership, according to the studies, is the most effective sort of leadership. And it means that you are more engaged with your employees, you're good at inspiring them, you're more democratic, you listen more, you're not just always on transmit, you're on receive as well. It's not a sort of top-down, hierarchical, very directional type of leadership. And the evidence shows that women are actually rather better at that than men. Some men are good at it too, and they make great leaders. But yeah, it does make us better leaders because we have to add emotional intelligence to cognitive intelligence, and we have to learn to read a room. Yeah.
Absolutely. Reading a room is so critical for women, and particularly women of color,
Yeah.
LGBTQ people, anyone, as Mary Ann said, that falls out. The further you go away from the white male ideal, you have to develop so much more in order to move ahead in your careers. Let's go back to that word ambition. You know, it is such a trigger word. I don't know if you know this, but I dropped out of the industry for 8.5 years. And when I was trying to come back in, one of the people said to someone who was looking to hire me back was, "You don't want to hire her, she's too ambitious. She'll have your job in a week."
Whoa.
And that was in 2007, and ambition was still a word because I grew up in the old school. I was embarrassed when I heard that word, and I shrank because it wasn't a positive word.
It's never a positive word when it's used about women.
Yes.
A profile of me once said, the word ambitious is used so often about Mary Ann Sieghart, her children probably think it's one of her middle names. But, you know, so I interviewed Elaine Chao, who was she was Transportation Secretary in the last US administration. And she was described in the New York Times, of all places, a liberal newspaper, as the unapologetically ambitious Elaine Chao. And I thought, what has she got to apologise about? She's a cabinet minister, for goodness sake. Of course she's ambitious. All politicians are ambitious, or they wouldn't be there. But why is that something to apologise for?
Yes.
You would never say of a man, the unapologetically ambitious,
Right.
whoever.
Yes.
Pete Buttigieg it is now, I think.
And it actually took me 10 years to step back into that.
Wow.
It took me that long to claim it.
Yeah.
And it does, in the book you talk about, as women age, we become more wiser and open to the fact that, and own who we are. And it was when I turned 55 that I actually stood in that, and I'm like, is that an insult? To be considered ambitious? Why am I shrinking from that?
Yeah.
You know, because this is who I am, and I'm not going to apologize for it anymore.
I mean, why shouldn't you be ambitious?
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. That's what we want.
Yeah.
So it's really, really interesting. There's something that you talked about in the book that it was quite interesting to me, and it was the internalized misogyny.
Yeah, we spoke a little bit about that when I was talking to Sonia.
Yeah.
I mean, in tests for unconscious bias, there's a test that a group of psychologists at Harvard have set up called the implicit association test. And it measures how quickly and accurately you can associate female nouns with work and family nouns. So it's just quicker, and you're likely to get it right more often, to associate mother with kitchen table and father with board table. And, you know, even when I did it, I'm mildly sexist on that score, because it measures your unconscious bias, not what you want to happen, but what your brain is doing. And women are just as biased on that test as men are. And in quite a few, but not all of the studies I cite in the book, women are as biased as men. So there's one real gold standard study, randomized double-blind controlled trial, that sort of thing. And they sent out applications for a lab manager position to science professors in top US universities. Exactly the same application, same CV, same covering letter, randomly assigned a male or a female name at the top. And the so-called male candidates were deemed to be significantly more hireable, were offered a higher starting salary, and the professors were keener on mentoring them than the female ones. And this was just as true of female science professors as of male ones. I made a BBC radio programme a couple of years ago about women's bias against women. And I asked the listeners to imagine a hijacker breaking into the cockpit of a plane and attacking the pilot. And then I said, now how are you picturing the pilot? I bet it's a white middle-aged man. And this woman called Margaret Oates tweeted, she said, listening to this programme, I was driving home in uniform and I was asked to picture a pilot. And yes, I pictured a white middle-aged man, despite being a female pilot. Wow. And that just shows how ingrained these biases are.
It is. Yeah. It is very true. and we need to speak up more for each other. We need to support each
Definitely.
other more. That's how we break this bias.
Yeah. Can I give an example of that?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
So when Obama first took over as president, there were 3 senior female aides on his team and quite a lot more male ones. And they used to have this morning meeting every morning to discuss what to do that day. And the women found their voices were just not being heard. You know, they would say something and the guys wouldn't take any notice, and the men would just carry on. So they devised what they called their amplification strategy. And that meant that whenever one of the women made a point, the other 2 women would pile in and say, oh yes, great idea. Oh yes, we should definitely do that. And it worked. And actually Obama himself noticed it, and he said, hey, you know, what are you women doing? And they explained. And he was mortified because, of course, he hadn't noticed that the men were, because on the whole, men don't notice these things. Why should they? It's not happening to them. Well, we'd like them to, of course, but it's not surprising they don't notice. And it worked.
Yes.
And that's what women really need to do. And actually the evidence shows that men will amplify each other on average much more in these situations than women will. And I think, again, it's something that they're socialized to do. So you'll often find at school, the popular boys will have sort of wingmen, you know, who'll laugh at all their jokes and big them up. And that's not so true of girls, actually. We need to learn to be better allies, I think.
Is that because of the scarcity mentality? Because women are still not in large enough numbers to feel the support? And oftentimes, because of that, women are actually used to further the patriarchy.
Yeah,
You know?
I think that is sort of true.
Yes.
So certainly in the generation above mine, you know, if a woman was promoted to a senior position, A, it was very rare, and B, she was the only one who was going to be. You know, there was only ever room for one woman around that table, and therefore she quite legitimately saw other women as threats because they weren't going to add to her number; they were going to replace her.
Right.
So that's part of it. I think there is also the fear that if you speak up for other women, men will think, oh God, that she's just being nepotistic. And so there's always a sort of, there's often a temptation to act like one of the lads.
Right.
And so they will want to include you in their nepotism,
Yes.
as it were.
Yes. And it was a very interesting part of the book where you talked about sometimes women are asked to promote stuff on Twitter or write articles against women because then it's more acceptable than if a male does it. So sometimes, and I thought that was really interesting, that we have to be careful about when we're used in that way to further an agenda that we don't want to further. So I thought that was a very interesting part of the book as well.
Thank you. Yeah, and it's particularly true in the media.
Yes.
So in right-wing newspapers, you get female columnists who are sort of editors' pets, who are asked to sort of write columns attacking female politicians, say.
Yes.
And then men will think, oh, well, if a woman's criticizing her, that can't be sexist, can it? It must be true.
Yes.
Whereas if a man did it, I think everyone now would understand how misogynistic it was.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. One other thing, what time is it? Because I want to give the audience the opportunity to ask questions. The imposter syndrome. That is a phrase that irritates the life out of me. Because why is it that women are labeled with that more than men when everybody suffers from imposter syndrome when you're doing something new?
I think everybody suffers from it, but women are twice as likely as men to say that they do. Now, that may be because men are more embarrassed about admitting vulnerability and therefore just won't admit it. But I was talking to my husband about this. I know this is very anecdotal. Most of the stuff in the book is very much evidence-backed. But he said, yeah, I do suffer from it, but it feels like it almost gives me the thrill of taking a corner too fast.
Right.
You know, if I'm new to a job and I know I don't really know my stuff and I'm sort of blagging it, and I'm sort of worried, but I'm also quite excited. But it's not surprising that if women do suffer from it more, and as I say, it may be that men aren't admitting it, it's not surprising because their authority is challenged much more. And I think that makes them feel like I don't deserve to be here because people aren't taking me seriously in this job.
Okay, I get that. But I was just, you know, it's everywhere you turn, and sometimes the descriptions that we give to ourselves become the truth of who we are.
Yeah.
So, and that word, that phrase gets used so much that I think people or women tend to step back because they think that they're really an imposter, versus when you're challenging yourself to grow, you're always going to feel like you don't belong there.
Yeah.
Until you get your feet under you.
It's true, but because so much of the reaction to us is a sort of woman, know your place.
Yes.
Right? I mean,
Yes.
we were talking about ambition.
Yes.
You know, basically, you're being told,
Yes.
know your place. Why are you ambitious? Why are you trying to be more successful?
Yes.
You should know your place.
Yes.
Right? Therefore,
And I get told that more than enough as a
Really?
woman of color.
Oof.
Yes.
Oof, it's
Not,
horrible, isn't it?
It's very subtle, but
Yeah.
it's there.
Exactly.
You know.
So that's bound to make us feel more imposterish because we're going out of, you know.
It actually doesn't make me feel imposterish. It makes me feel disappointed, upset, because as a woman of color who sponsors a lot of people, who a lot of people look to, it makes me feel that I'm not living up to their expectation. You know, that am I creating a false picture of what the world is really going to be like for them? So when I get like that, I actually talk to them and tell them the truth of where I am, so that they will have the tools, hopefully, to be able to navigate through that and not look at this holy grail as being easy.
Yeah.
So, but it's a really tough position, particularly as the only one.
Yeah, I bet.
Often, yes.
The advice I often give my two daughters is, when it comes to things like imposter syndrome, or basically anything that makes them scared or nervous, I say to them, tell yourself not, before a job interview or something like that, tell yourself not, I'm scared, but I'm excited.
Yes.
Because being excited has exactly the same physiological symptoms as being nervous.
Yes.
You know, your heart rate goes up, you might be sweating a bit more, that sort of thing.
Yes.
And if you can turn that, it's a bit like my husband saying it's like taking a corner too
Yes.
fast. Try and make yourself excited rather than scared.
Yes, yes. And then before we open up for questions, the other one was about the books.
Oh, this is a real bugbear of mine. Okay, so if it isn't bad enough that what we say and write isn't taken as seriously as men, is not taken to be as authoritative as what men do, quite often we're just not even listened to or read in the first place. So it's like sort of talking or writing into the void, right? So women on average will read roughly 50-50 books written by men and books written by women. For men, the average is 80-20. So they're 4 times more likely to read a book written by a man than one written by a woman. So, I mean, I look at this audience here, I hope it's more even online, but it's about 98% female. And why aren't there, thank you so much to the guys who've come, but you know, yay, woot woot. But why are there not more men in this room? This isn't a female issue, this is an issue for humanity, for the whole of humanity. I really fought with my publishers. I wanted my name on the cover to be M.A. Sieghart rather than Mary Ann, partly as a sort of in-joke, but also to try to persuade more men to read the book. Because, I mean, the book is very validating for women, and it's very useful because it makes them realize that a lot of what they're up against isn't personal, it's systemic. But if men don't read it, nothing will change.
Yes, yes, and that is so true. I loved what you said about how when women write books, it's about the culture, about the community, about the family, about the experiences that we have. And if men are not reading it, they're not understanding how 50% of the population is operating. And that perpetuates the problem of all of the authority gap that happens. Okay.
I mean, men, you know, if men ever say, oh, women are such a mystery, think, just read some books written by them and there won't be any more.
Yes, exactly. And the books that were successful were the women who put initials or used...
George Eliot or J.K. Rowling. Or, absolutely.
And because men didn't realize they were reading a book by a woman.
Yeah.
So, really, really interested. All right. So, Mary Ann, did you want to close out with anything before we open the questions? Or
no, I think you know, we've done pretty well.
Okay.
So we want to give you time to ask some questions. Tiffany?
Hi. Thank you so much for your discussion. It's been fascinating. I just recently read an article about hybrid working and how it's increasing the gender equality and promotion, with women lagging behind their male coworkers. So I'm just wondering how women in companies can combat this and the increasing authority gap that's opened up because of hybrid working.
Do you want, shall I just repeat that? Yes.
I can repeat the question.
Okay,
yeah,
sure.
sure. So for our virtual audience, the question is around hybrid work and how it is impacting or probably widening that authority gap for women. And we're asked from you for advice on how we can combat that.
Yeah, I think I read the same article as you. Yeah, it is a worry, this, because what tends to happen with working from home, particularly, is that women, or mothers at least, are more likely to take up the opportunity to do that, which is great. I'm very much in favour of more flexible working. But on the other hand, if the guys are going back into the office more and the women are working from home, the guys are going to be doing all the schmoozing in the office politics and impressing their managers, and the women might be, producing just as good output, but of course the men are then getting rewarded for it because they're there, they're there in the office. And I think you need a lot of really good training of managers. I mean, you're in HR, and I hope you're doing this, I'm sure you are, but a lot of good training of managers to judge workers absolutely objectively by their output, and not by the sort of office politics that they're doing. I think that's the only hope for...
What was the word that you used for that?
Schmoozing.
Was it schmoozing? It was a great word. I wish I could find it, where it's like bluffery almost.
Blagging.
Or
bullshitting.
It was all the blagging, that, and that actually goes back to the self-promotion.
Yeah, very much.
When women self-promote, it's negative.
Yeah, so people really recoil from women who self-promote. There's lots of evidence to show this, which makes life really difficult for women because, suppose you go to a job interview and people are asked, suppose you're asked, and it sounds like an innocuous, friendly question, so tell us about your best achievement that you're proudest of. A woman will think, oh my God, I'm not allowed to do this. And so she'll say something safe like, oh, my 2 wonderful children, okay? And you think, oh, sweet. And then the male candidate is asked the same question. He says, well, in my last job, I doubled revenues and I quadrupled profit margins. And you think, well, he's the one we're going to have to hire, right? Women are not allowed to self-promote.
Right.
And men do because, again, they've been socialized to do. So there's a wonderful academic paper that actually has bullshitting in the title, where they looked at 15-year-olds in about 20 different countries, and they asked them how familiar they were with the following mathematical concepts and how well did they know how to apply them. And there were 16 mathematical concepts into which the researchers had inserted 4 that don't even exist.
Yes.
And in every single country, teenage boys were much more likely than teenage girls to say, yep, familiar with the concept, yep, really good at applying it, even though it didn't even exist. Yep.
Amazing. Erica?
Yes, thank you so much to you and the panel. I had a question and a comment as well in terms of we're in a society now that is hyper-focused on diversity. So how do we navigate through sort of virtue signaling or performative allyship in this world where you have people that are pretending to doing performative allyship? Can you give us some insight into that?
So for our virtual audience, the question is around performative allyship. Those that aren't really being genuine around being an ally, how do you suggest we combat that?
I think you just really need to look at the data. You've really got to burrow down and look at how your organization is doing. And so I say 2 things. For an organization that wants to change, it wants to narrow the authority gap, I say, first of all, get as many of your female employees as you can into one room without any men and guarantee them anonymity. And then ask them, what's the culture like in this organization? Are you listened to as much as your male colleagues? Do you get interrupted? Are you being passed over for promotion? All this sort of thing. And then I think you will find they've got lots of stories to tell, and then take the results to senior management and say, this is what the culture's like now. do we want to change it? Of course we want to change it. So how are we going to go about it? And I've got lots of suggestions in the last chapter, 140 I counted the other day, for solutions for narrowing the authority gap. So start with what the culture is actually like, and also measure how women are doing in your organization, and disaggregate it by white women, women of color, different, black, Hispanic, whatever, South Asian, and also, if you like, by class, because class is another problem. Middle class people, women tend to do better than working class women. And then track that data, because otherwise it's all too easy to think, oh, we're doing really well on equality, because you might have slightly more women than you had 10 years ago, but you've still got 3 times as many men.
Exactly.
Yeah.
We have some questions from online. So the first one is, I would describe myself as a confident, successful woman. So far, I have had notably more negative experiences when being managed by women rather than men. At present, I work for a female-dominated leadership team with a very clear female leadership clique, which I am not a part of. I am more successful than my peers across virtually every metric, but have never, never feel like I often witness the leadership group behaving in unprofessional ways in terms of language and behaviors. What is your advice to overcome these obstacles to my growth?
Oh, I'm really sorry to hear that. Actually, I'm really sorry. Because in general, this is what's called the queen bee syndrome, when women don't help other women. It's not as common as it used to be. And in fact, in general, it doesn't happen. So there was a big study done of companies worldwide, and they looked at whether companies with a female CEO had more or fewer senior women at the level below. If she was a queen bee, you'd expect fewer women. But actually, companies with a female CEO were 50% more likely to have a female CFO or COO. So that suggests that women, on average, are helping other women to rise. I'm sorry to say, and it sounds a bit drastic, but my advice is move. Because if she's in a toxic atmosphere, toxic work atmosphere, and if she's being held back by the women at the top, I would just say move. Sorry to say it.
Yep. Can we do, and then?
Just going off from the question that just now, do you think this is like a survival move where women are sort of facing this authority gap and this negative behavior? Is it because they're trying to survive themselves and so they're kind of using it against other women?
Got it. So for our virtual audience, the question is further on the queen bee syndrome. Is it that women are just trying to survive and that's why they act this way against each other?
It tends to happen much more in male-dominated workplaces where there are fewer women. So the more sexist the workplace, the more likely this behavior is to happen. And I think it's just that it's the only way to stay in with the men. And so you've sort of got to decide which side you're on. It's what's called the patriarchal bargain when it comes to American politics. Why did white women vote for Donald Trump? It's a sort of patriarchal bargain. But generally, the less sexist the workplace, the less this happens. So that's why I'm surprised that it's happened in a very female-dominated organization.
I would be curious to know what the organization is outside of that division, because that is somebody who's specifically talking about a department, right? That could be the only department that is majority women.
Yeah.
And that woman is probably, who's leading that group, maybe the only person who's sitting at the leadership table and may feel that she's being judged. So it's much harder on the team. So it'll be interesting for that person to flesh that out, because with leadership, it's never really in isolation. It's always in conjunction with so many other things. And I'm not giving that person an excuse, and I'm not saying to that person to stay. We all have to do what's right for us, but it will be interesting to understand the dynamics of that organization.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so this question is from Brittany online. It says, the current discussion goes to my question. How do we engage men? Is it mandatory sessions in the workplace, but then will they feel a bit pressured? How do we move this forward?
Yeah, it's a really good question, that. I mean, I would love men to be more involved in this conversation, as I said earlier. I think what really helps is being told from the top that this is something that the organization really cares about, and that they're going to be judged on, you know, how they chair meetings. Do they allow women to be interrupted without intervening themselves? So they're going to be judged on their behavior, frankly, and they're going to be judged on how successful they are at recruiting and promoting women at in equal numbers to men. So you need the CEO to say, this is something I really care about, and I want to see change in the organization. They'll be judged on it. Ideally, their pay will be linked to it.
Can I just want to add to that. You know, Dive In started 7 years ago by Inga Bill, who was the chair of Lloyd's at the time, because she really wanted CEOs involved in these conversations, because these conversations become performative if the CEOs are not walking the walk.
Yeah.
If we're looking around this room, I'm hoping that there are more that are online, but if we're looking around this room, there's not that many CEOs in here, right? So are we perpetuating the problem if we're speaking to the converted?
Well, you're not solving it anyway.
Right? You know, it's a very interesting question about what happens when we don't have the decision makers in the room and taking this seriously as well. We have another question?
I thought she had it. Yeah, it was a very, very similar one, because I think what we're facing is, because inclusion and diversity is such a big topic at the moment, many of our male colleagues acknowledge it, but at the same time feel, well, I'm not part of the problem. There's other men, and I feel very sorry for the situation that you're in, but it's other men and I'm trying to help it. But I think it's the small things, as you mentioned earlier, taking interrupted meetings and trip over or ignore being used, which happens for many of those colleagues who consider themselves as not part of the problem. So how do we get them to make themselves more familiar, even though they don't see themselves as the problem and they think they are supportive of us, genuinely, probably, but how do we get them to be more familiar with the topic, read books like yours, come to those events?
Well, sorry, you want to repeat that?
Yes, so how do we help men who think they are not part of the problem understand that they do need to be more proactive or more of an ally when it comes to the authority gap?
I mean, leave my book on their desk.
And put a black mark over the name.
Yes.
Of the author.
Yes. Because men often don't notice this. As I said earlier, why should they? I use the analogy of, it's as if we're all swimming in a river, right? And men are swimming with the current, quite a strong current, and they see the banks racing past them. They can't feel the current, but they see the banks racing past them, and they think, wow, I'm a strong swimmer. And they see women swimming in the opposite direction, struggling to make headway against the current, and they think, well, they're just clearly not as good at swimming as I am, because they don't feel the current. And, you know, we shouldn't blame men for this, because, you know, I'm white, and so I'm probably in the same position when it comes to colour. I try to educate myself, so I try to read books and to talk to people and, you know, find out about their lived experience. But that's the only way I'm going to really understand my bias, is by making a conscious effort. And if they haven't made a conscious effort, they're not going to notice their bias. So I think somehow we need to explain to them that you may think you're one of the good guys, but you won't actually be until you really educate yourself about this. And you may discover that you're doing things like, so I talk about something that I call conversational manspreading, which is basically just taking up disproportionate conversational time. And it's like, you know, you see men sitting on the tube in London like this, and they're just taking up too much space, and it's a sort of metaphorical equivalent of that. And I think a lot of men who think they're one of the good guys don't notice that, you know, they'll have a conversation with a woman, and they will be talking for 3/4 of the time, and she'll only get the chance to speak for 1/4 of the time. And they're not doing it in a malign way, and they're not even doing it deliberately. But it's only once they start to notice this sort of behaviour that they're going to be able to change.
Doesn't that then put the emphasis back on us to actually start calling behaviour out more often and try and break that inherent behaviour that
So the emphasis is back on us inherently from charging this change.
To call out the
To call
behaviour,
out the
yes.
behaviour, yes.
I mean, it's a really tricky one, this, calling out the behaviour. Since I've written the book, I've decided I'm just jolly well going to call it out whenever I see it. And I'm not making friends, let's be honest. So, for instance, there was a man I was talking to the other day who was talking about this girl who was a BBC reporter. Oh, this girl, yeah, she's really good. And I said, how old do you think she is? And he said, I don't know, why? I don't know, mid-40s or something. I said, so you mean she's a woman, not a girl, right? You wouldn't say this boy if it were, you know, a man in his 40s. And he sort of thought about it and said, oh, well, I just always say girl, you know. Yeah, but maybe, you know, have a think about that, because it's sort of infantilizing of women. And I could tell he thought afterwards, oh, bloody hell, you know, stroppy, difficult woman. Why? But then I think, if I don't call it out, who will? I've written the book on it, after all. And I've sort of got to an age where I don't care if he likes me or not. But it is really difficult. And so what I advise, particularly for younger women who are worried about this being sort of career damaging, you know, find an ally. So suppose you often get interrupted in a meeting by a particular man. Either ask, you know, go and talk quietly to the chair of that meeting afterwards and say, I don't know if you've noticed, but this guy always interrupts me, and I'd love it if you could call him out next time. Or recruit an ally amongst other colleagues who can say, sorry, what's your name? Rebecca. Who can say, you know, if you get interrupted, oh, hang on a minute, I was really interested in what Rebecca was saying there. Or if you make a point, no one takes any notice, 10 minutes later a man gets credit for it, you can say to the man, oh, I'm so glad you agree with what Rebecca said earlier. You know.
I do actually, I have started calling out a lot more and trying to stand up, especially for the young women in my organisation.
Good.
You're right, if we don't, then they're not going to stand up for themselves. And I'm hoping that the more they see me standing up for them, the more they will do it for themselves, and the more they will do it for others as well in similar situations.
Yeah, fantastic.
Yeah, but like you, I'm not making any friends.
So we have another question from the virtual room. How should women that just accessed a leadership position react when they are asked to prove themselves over and over again to gain credibility?
Sorry, yes, the question is, how should women in senior position react when they're asked to prove themselves over and over again to gain credibility? It's just so hard because the world is the way it is. And I would love to say, just ignore it. But on the other hand, people aren't going to take you seriously unless you do provide evidence. So I feel really torn about this. And so many of the questions I get are, how should women change and how should women behave? And what I want to say is, women aren't the problem. It's not women we need to fix. It's how we all react to and interact with and perceive women that we need to fix. And the onus shouldn't be put back on women the whole time. So it's a really tricky one. Again, I would say maybe have a word with your manager and say, you know, so-and-so kept challenging my authority. You know, I think this is pretty inappropriate. Maybe you could have a word with him. Difficult though.
I just want to add something to that, and I wish I had my phone. I left it outside because I didn't want to interrupt this, but I don't know if any of you have ever listened to Van Jones on Common Ground. He has a podcast, and he was talking about the whole point of his podcast is that in order for us to make any progress, we have to be able to speak to people that we don't agree with or that we need to help us to affect change, because if we're always speaking to the same people or people that agree with us, which is unfortunately what social media has done, then we think we're always right. But he also says that to progress any sort of change, the people that want the change, unfortunately, we have to be our own champions. Because, as Mary Ann said over and over again, a lot of times people don't realize that they're actually perpetuating the problem, because when they look around them, they're in the majority. So in order for us to make progress, it's exhausting, it's tiring, you want to scream, you want to shout, but we have to keep the dialogue going. And we have to, because once you do that, you realize that we're all looking for the same thing, and that is to be seen, heard, and validated. And right now there's so much pressure on all sides, because the world is changing so much, that fear is really coming out, and that's why we're seeing so much pushback, because there is so much fear of what the world is going to look like. So if you want to listen to a podcast about finding strength and keeping going, listen to Van Jones's Uncommon Ground. It's a phenomenal podcast, and he talks to people that hate him. He talks to all sorts of different people to get different perspectives. So unfortunately, for those of us that are trying to find our voice and our equity and our inclusion, we have to be the ones that keep the conversation going.
And I think the more senior we are, the easier it is for us to do it as well.
Sometimes. Sometimes, particularly, like DEI is such a trigger.
Yeah,
it is such a trigger.
There's evidence I cite in the book that men who get involved in DEI are rewarded for it, and women are punished for it because they're seen to be being nepotistic.
Yes, we have.
Thank you. Do you believe that it's going to be harder for the older generation to make that transition, and for the younger generation who are more brazen to get past this authority gap? Because we are so ingrained in taking a step back, and as you said, that word ambition, it took you several years before you came to the realization that you're authentic and you're going to be who you are. So is it too late for us in the older generation?
Never too late.
We focus on, continuing to educate the younger generation, because they're going to be the one to make that transition as opposed to us moving forward. What is your advice in terms of what is your advice in terms of, keeping us motivated and trying to make that shift, but also making sure that the younger generation don't fall into the same trap that we're in now?
Yeah. For the online audience, the question is around, is it harder for the older generation of women, and what advice do you have for us and for the younger generation to impart and help continue narrowing the authority gap?
Yeah, good question. I mean, in some senses, it's harder for us because we were probably socialized even more traditionally than younger women. On the other hand, I do find, and I think you mentioned this too, that the older I get, the braver I get. And there's something rather fabulous about being postmenopausal.
Yes,
and you just it's true. It's true. You just don't give a toss anymore. and I sort of feel I've got much less to lose now. I just don't care so much. So in a sense, that's good. That makes me feel stronger. But as you say, that we've got more sort of unconscious, well, actually we haven't got more unconscious bias to overcome. We've got more socialization to overcome. Right. What really surprised me and slightly depressed me in researching this book was that when it comes to unconscious bias, the young are just as biased as the old. Liberals are just as biased as conservatives. Women are just as biased as men. And in fact, there were quite a few research studies I came across showing that young men are just as biased as older men. So, there was one done of biology students who are by definition, 19, 20, 21 at college. And they were asked to nominate who were the smartest and best informed members of their class, and there are several times through the course of the academic year. And the young women spotted them very accurately. The young men were much more likely to nominate another man than a woman, even if the woman was better than the man. And this disparity increased during the course of the year as they got to know their classmates better. And these are young men not rating the females in their class even when they deserved it. So I find that quite depressing.
We've got 5 minutes. I have a question over here.
So my question actually really tails to Jillian's. As mothers, what are some suggestions or tips when we're helping to raise our children so that they're not as sort of closed-minded or have certain viewpoints? Like, what can we be doing, especially if we have boys, to try and sort of make the world a better place?
So what advice do you have for mothers or parents to help us raise children that are more aware of the authority gap?
Yeah, this is so important. I mean, we could narrow the authority gap in one generation if we raised our children better. So first of all, the most important thing, if you're in a straight relationship, is for you and the father to have equal authority at home. Because that's the first thing that is burned on their brains, is how their mum and dad act and how they act towards each other. So, you know, your father should be absolutely respecting your mother equally in order for you to get the feeling that men and women are and ought to be equal. So that's really important. Secondly, really resist gender stereotyping your children. So, you know, don't automatically, you know, teach your daughter how to cook and your son how to fix cars. You know, my husband, we've only got daughters, made them climb the biggest tree he could, and he used to set them what he called braveness challenges to try to make them really sort of physically and psychologically brave. And he would have done the same to boys, but it was good that he was doing that to girls. There's often a natural inclination for, if you've got a boy and a girl, for the dad to take the boy off to do something, the mother to take the girl off to do something. Try and reverse that as much as you can. And don't always use the word boy and girl. You know, what a good girl you are, what a clever boy you are, because then you're just constantly drawing attention to the gender thing, which isn't necessary. Don't praise your daughter for being pretty and your son for being clever, which is a classic thing, that we praise girls for being ornamental and boys for being instrumental. You know, boys for achieving things, girls for looking good. And that subliminally is going to make them feel that that's what they're going to be judged on in later life. And actually, one of the saddest pieces of research I came across asked parents to estimate their children's IQ. And they estimated their sons on average at 115 and their daughters at only 107. Despite the fact that girls develop faster than boys, have a bigger vocabulary than boys, do better at school than boys on average. And we all know that boys and girls are identically intelligent on average, except at the very far ends of the IQ curve. But boys are growing up subliminally with this notion that they're cleverer than girls, and girls are absorbing this notion subliminally that they're less clever than boys. And so the same researchers asked adult men and women to estimate their own IQs, and the adult men estimated on average their IQ to be 110, adult women only 105. And that's just based on inaccurate information. It's because of how their parents treated them.
It's time for a wrap up. As a mother of a son and a daughter, it's also the social environment that they're in. Going to school, going to work, going to clubs, going to all sorts of things that actually can dismantle some of the beliefs that they are raised with in a household as well.
Absolutely.
Particularly, I have a daughter who's very, very outspoken, and she was almost silenced by her prior school before she went to university, and now she doesn't speak up as much.
Well, that's so
and I'm
sad.
trying so hard to get that back, but she said, I became the scapegoat.
That's really sad.
And I can't do that again because of what I want to do. And that is crushing. You know, so it's everything. It's everything. But more than anything, it's just being there to listen and not always give advice, because they'll tell you off about that. Sometimes it's like, I just want you to hear me. I don't want you to tell me what to do. But you know, it's particularly in a world where social media is so prevalent, and it's very easy for those stereotypes to be perpetuated, particularly the movies people watch, the gaming that people get involved in, television, the books, all sorts of things reinforce those stereotypes, and it's going to take a while before we move beyond that. But if
They're changing. They're getting better.
changing, but if we keep putting one foot in front of the other, and not giving up on any of us, then hopefully we would affect the change. Mary Ann, I don't know if you wanted to wrap up with anything. You've been amazing.
Well,
thank you.
Oh, thank you. I mean, I guess I just want to say I am optimistic.
Yes.
You know, I really think we can change if we want to.
Yes.
But we've got to be more aware of this unconscious bias in ourselves. So, you know, however liberal or intelligent or female we are, we should admit that we have this unconscious bias. We can't put a lid on it. We shouldn't be ashamed of it. It's called unconscious for a reason. But we can notice when it manifests itself and try and do something about it. Women as well as men, but particularly men.
Yes. Thank you. Sonia?
Perfect. Thank you to everybody. Cathy, Mary Ann, thank you to our in-person and our virtual audience. A note for our in-person audience, XIXL did sponsor a book for everybody who joined us today in person. However, we ran into delays. We do have your email, and we will be emailing you a point of where you will be able to collect your copy of the book. So thank you for joining us today. This was fantastic. Hopefully this is a topic that we walk away with empowered to be self-aware and action for ourselves and others.
And here's my dog, puppy.
Thank you, Sonia.